So if we remember last month when Pesach was coming, how much we prepared for it, we worked week after week cleaning, ordering things, finding out what would be secured in terms of food, in terms of everything we needed. So the big reveal tonight to start the class is that this Friday is Pesach once again. So we still have a few days left to get ready, but it's called Pesach Sheni. And as you go to shul, what you will see is that they don't say Tachnun that day on Friday, because Pesach Sheni is a holiday. It's not a holiday that we can observe anymore, and we'll discuss the background of it quickly. But it's a holiday specified in the Torah, and in fact, it's the only holiday that falls in this month, this Hebrew month of Emor. So what does it mean to have a Pesach Sheni? It means as follows. If you look at the Torah, it's in the book of Bamidbar, in the next book of the Torah, chapter 9, sentence 6, on page 779. And I'll give you the background to it here. The Jewish people, interestingly enough, they went out of Egypt on the 15th of Nisan in the Hebrew year 2448. And in the interim, they came to Mount Sinai, as we're counting nowadays up to the 7 weeks that lead up to Shavuot. And they stood at Mount Sinai and they listened to God proclaim the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 statements, 10 commandments. They found themselves weeks later worshiping a golden calf and seeking forgiveness for that. They rededicated the Mishkan 1 year on the first day of Nisan in the Hebrew year 2449, just shy of 1 year after leaving Egypt in the Exodus. And then on the 15th of that month, it was Pesach. So what did they do? They brought the Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering. They did all the things that we are perhaps familiar with from temple days. They ate matzah, they had a seder. Noteworthy is the fact that in the 40 years that the Jewish people sojourned in the wilderness, they only celebrated Pesach that 1 year. So in truth, they celebrated Pesach twice. Once before the Exodus took place, while they were still in Egypt, just as the 10th plague was happening, they sat down in their homes before the Exodus happened, and they ate from the Paschal lamb, and they ate matzah. And then the firstborn passed away, and Paro came in his pajamas, as we teach our kids, and he shooed the Jewish people out of Egypt. So that was the first time in history Pesach was celebrated by the Jewish people. The next time was 1 year later, as we just described. And then there was a 39-year hiatus until they entered the land of Canaan under the leadership of Yoshua. And very famously, they circumcised themselves because they didn't have circumcision while they were traveling around in the wilderness. And they celebrated Pesach again. And people ask just parenthetically, what was God's plan exactly? Why celebrate Pesach once again, 1 year after leaving, when you know you're not going to celebrate it for many years thereafter? It's not going to be another till they enter the land of Canaan, enter the land of Israel. And the answer is that God wanted the first celebration of Pesach after the Exodus to be conducted by the very people who went out and who truly could feel through and through. They could see themselves as having been rescued from Egypt because they had been. It was actually their experience. And that sort of solidified the collective memory of the Jewish people, so that 40 years later, after all the travails and travels in the wilderness and entered the land of Israel, under the leadership of Yeshua, when they sat down next, and after always 1 generation had passed away, another generation had come, they could still recreate that association, which is what we talked about before Pesach ourselves, when we talked about seeing ourselves in a meaningful way as though we had exited from Egypt. Okay, so that all happened. First year out, they celebrate Pesach. A few weeks go by, and as it's recorded in the Torah in the book of Bamidbar, a couple of people came to Moshe And they said something, we have been left out. And they asked Moshe directly, Lama nigara. Why should we be deprived of bringing Hashem's offering just like the rest of the children of Israel did? So here we have an event. An event takes place. So let's first understand, who are these people? What was happening that somebody would become tameh, ritually impure, and therefore would not have been able to bring the Paschal offering together with the rest of the Jewish people on that first anniversary of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the exodus from Egypt? And the answer, a few answers given, but the most obvious one was that they had agreed to bring Joseph's bones and remains with them out of Egypt. And although Moshe took charge of that process, he probably had other people carrying Joseph's body. So these people were tameh. They were involved in carrying a dead body. So look at this. They found themselves in a position where they were involved in doing a mitzvah. They were fulfilling the wishes of Joseph, their ancestor, to bring his remains with them up to the land of Israel. They were doing everything right. And lo and behold, when the first Pesach took place, they were on the sidelines. They were ritually impure. They couldn't bring the offering. And they approached Moshe distraught and wondering, what about us? Are we chopped liver? If they would have been from a later date, they would have asked that question. I don't know how quickly the Jewish people adopted chopped liver as a staple, but that was their issue. And you can imagine how they felt. Here we're involved in a mitzvah, and doing one mitzvah deprives us of another. But wait a second. If you look at Jewish law, in truth, it happens oftentimes where we have a rule that if you're really involved in performing a mitzvah, you're exempt. You're not required, you're not obligated to do another mitzvah. And this is a very practical thing. And an example would be, to use a vivid example related to this, if I were to be on the road and I know that I have to say Shema every morning before 8:40 in the morning, but if I'm walking along the road at 7 o'clock and I encounter a dead person, so it's a mitzvah on me, it's incumbent on me to bury that person properly. So it takes a couple of hours to bury a person. So I'm digging a grave, I'm preparing the body for burial, I bury the person, I cover them up. I look at my watch and I say, oh, it's noontime already. Did I do a sin by not saying the Shema? Absolutely not. I was exempt from that mitzvah because I was committed to doing another mitzvah. That's the rule. And therefore I have no guilt. I don't have to beat my brow. I don't have to feel as though I'm put down. That's the system that God has designed for us. Osek b'mitzvah, if you're involved in a mitzvah, then you're exempt from doing another mitzvah. So why didn't these people back then in the wilderness convey that feeling and say, okay, look, that's the way it goes. You know, we have the honor of carrying the remains of Joseph back to Israel. It's a great honor to do that, fulfill the wishes of our ancestor, our distinguished ancestor. So we weren't able to bring the Korban Pesach. And here we get to the crux of tonight's class, the title being of feeling deprived. Now, we're familiar with people feeling deprived, right? You come home after a long day of work and you look at the driveway of the guy next to you and you see that he just bought the latest, greatest Tesla or whatever it is today. And you feel deprived. Well, you know, I'm still driving my thing. He's got that. I feel deprived. We're used to feeling deprived. And we know that the sense of FOMO, of missing out, feeling as though we're getting the short end of the stick, we know how this attitude can cast a shadow upon every relationship we have between husbands and wives, parents and children. Kid comes home from school, I got to work on this computer to do my homework. I was talking to a classmate and they've got a computer twice as fast with much more graphics. That's why they're doing better in school. You're not living up to your responsibility as a parent, which in 2023 is certainly to provide your child with the latest and greatest technology that could possibly be had any place in the world. So we know what deprivation means. But look what's so interesting here. Look what's so eye-opening about the concept of Pesach Sheni, of this second Passover. It came from people taking that feeling of having missed out and applying it to a spiritual dimension of life. And this is why, in my mind, Pesach Sheni fits in so strongly with the theme and the ideas that we've been developing over the last couple of weeks about Kedusha, which all revolve around increasing and solidifying and deepening an ongoing relationship between man and God, between us human beings and Hashem. Kedoshim tiyu ki kadosh ani, be holy like I'm holy. We understood to mean I'm going to take every action I can to make myself a more fitting relation to Hashem. And that's what mitzvot are. All mitzvot are that. Mitzvot have a dimension to them of impacting me so that I become more, I strengthen that image of God within me. And therefore, I'm a better match in terms of friendship, in terms of connection, in terms of being a servant, being a worshiper, however words you want to use. It makes me a greater match with God. So what you see here is that this chapter, this holiday that we're going to talk about it more in a wider context in a moment. This Pesach Sheni, which many of us are not that familiar with, and is accustomed to take out your old matzahs and to bite into them on Friday. No prohibition of chametz, nothing. You don't have to clean the house. But it reminds us of this idea, what some people call a second chance, but it's different than a second chance. You see, a second chance is putting down the concept of Pesach Sheni. The concept of Pesach Sheni is, if I am a human being who yearns to be part of the Jewish people, who yearns to have a relationship with God, then I don't want your exemption. It doesn't satisfy me. And so these people approached Moshe with a heartfelt plea, and they say, we are being deprived. We're missing out. A couple of million Jewish people a month ago got together, offered the Paschal Lamb, sat down and had their Seder, talked about going out of Egypt. We were excluded from the privilege, from the opportunity to draw that much closer to God, and therefore we are deprived. Lama nigara. We are lessened. You know, in Hebrew, they don't use the word garua very often. But if somebody tells you, did you have good seats at the baseball game tonight? You'd say, no, they were garua. They were less than. They weren't up to snuff. I didn't capture the experience the way I'd want to. And that's the sense of yearning on a spiritual level that we're reading about when we look at these people approaching Moshe almost a month afterwards. And Moshe considering their request, considering the pain that they feel of not having been connected to the rest of the Jewish people at this great moment of celebrating Pesach. And Moshe acknowledges their feeling. Moshe understands them. So what does Moshe say? Moshe says, I'll ask God. Let me talk to God about this. I think something important is here. Perhaps Moshe was saying, I detect a certain holiness and sincerity and human outcry within your feelings that you're presenting to me. So let me inquire of God. And Moshe gets a response. God says, we're going to create a new holiday. We're going to create a Pesach Sheni. We're going to go into this month later of Emor, which is bereft of festivals. We're counting our way up towards Shavuot, one of the three great festivals of the Jewish people. But we're going to add this one, because that yearning to be elevated, and not to be deprived of spiritual connection is so precious and it's so holy. It needs to be codified into the calendar of the Jewish people, and it needs to be honored as such a wonderful part of what Judaism is all about. And that's what's happening on Friday. It was easy for us to just go through Friday without noticing, but when we take the time to notice and look at it, it's very, very ennobling to think that that happened. And now I want to play it out. We're going to use this word Gorah, Gimel Resh Ayin, which I'm pretty sure only appears 3 times in the Torah, which means deprived, less than, shoddy. I don't know how exactly, I mean, I don't know precise, great translation. But Loma Nigara means, why should we be diminished? Why should we be deprived? Why should we be left out? So we see this again, the same language being used by who? By the 5 daughters of Tzlofchad. Tzlofchad was a person who, different opinions, but according to one, he was executed for violating Torah law. And this takes place much later in the book of Bamidbar. It's chapter 27, sentence 4. You can read about it in 887. And what happens there is, as they're ready to enter the land of Israel, and Moshe discusses how inheritance works, these 5 daughters of the deceased man Tzlofchad realize that according to the framework of Jewish law that Moshe has presented, they're not inheritors, which means that their father is Nigara. He's going to be left out, and he's not going to have a portion in the land of Israel. And again, not because they want the real estate, and not because they want an opportunity to marry a more upper crust, they can bring their properties. We're not talking about England in the 18th century, where a fine landed lady had the best chance to secure the best marriage. But rather, again, we're talking about a spiritual yearning. And I want to add a dimension I think that's clear here. It's a very special dimension to what these daughters brought. What they say there in the book of Bamidbar is, Loma Yigara Shem Avinu. Why should our father's name be deprived? In a certain sense, why should our father's name be written out of the legacy of the Jewish people? We're his daughters. We want to take up that banner. We want to inherit his portion in the land of Israel so that we can go in as his representatives, and so that our children who will inhabit these lands will ultimately be his spiritual legacy, keeping him alive in the annals and the history, keeping his place within the Jewish people. Again, a very sublime idea. And I read a story that Beryl Wine tells, that when he got to Israel, he was working with certain Israeli ministers, and the one particular one he was working with was particularly not an observant person, a person who they call Chiloni in Israel, secular person. And that the two of them happened to be together when it was time to go to a state funeral, and they got in a cab together and they went to the funeral. And when they arrived and Beryl Wine was walking in, the minister said to him, "Look, I'm not going in. I'm a Kohen. I'm my Aaron was my ancestor." And it says in the Torah that we Kohanim, we don't go to funerals. So Beryl Wine found this very remarkable. And he said to the man, he said, Chaim, whatever his name was, we've worked together so many times. You eat whatever food you eat. You live your life completely ignoring the mitzvot of Hashem. Why does this stand out to you? Why would you not go into this funeral with me? He said, because I want to honor my parents' legacy. This is the one thing I recognize, that my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather, and throughout these generations, they were all Kohanim. And they all lived within the confines of a Kohen. And this is an aspect of Judaism I honor. And when I read that story, I thought of these daughters of Tzlafchad. And there's another connection that my wife pointed out to me, which I think is also a very beautiful connection. You know, we have levirate marriage in the Torah. When Nebuch, if a person passes away, passes away and he's married, he has no children. So a brother takes his widow as a wife, and in a spiritual level, the children that she will bear are the heirs of the deceased brother. Okay? In a far-fetched way, it's like lighting a Yortzeit candle. What they're doing is perpetuating a legacy of a person who was married and unfortunately passed away childless. In a way, you see, that's what the Benos Chavchad were doing here. So we need to understand, again, they weren't after anything more than honoring the spiritual existence of their father and wanting to see to it that that continues in the Jewish people. So what did they do? They do exactly the same thing. They use the same language. They approach Moshe and they say, Moshe, could it be that you're overlooking a facet of the laws of inheritance in the Torah? Because wouldn't it make sense for us daughters to inherit our father's portion in the land? And once again, Moshe recognizes the spiritual loftiness of their request, takes it seriously, brings it to God, and Moshe comes back and teaches forever for the Jewish people how daughters do in fact inherit their father. And they created a new dimension of Torah. We could really say that. As did the carriers of the remains of Yosef in creating, through their questioning and through the purity of their yearning to be more deeply connected with the mission of the Jewish people, to be elevated through each and every mitzvah, they connected to that. And I'll tell you an example of this, a very interesting example. We read at the end of the Torah that Moshe was yearning to go into the land of Israel. And God kept saying, no, 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 no. And finally, in Vaschanan, God answers Moshe and says, stop praying to me to go into the land of Israel. Pretty harsh moment, because you're not going in. And people ask, okay, what would Moshe? He stood on, he led the Jewish people out of Egypt. He stood on Mount Sinai. He spoke and interacted face to face with Hashem. He brought the Torah into the Jewish people and presented it to us. Isn't that enough? Isn't it enough? Didn't he, when he had to argue and fight with God, give me an opportunity to go into the land? And commentaries say, because he recognized the fact that there are many, many mitzvot, many of the 613 commandments are called tluya ba'aretz. They're attached to the land. And he never experienced them. He was deprived of the opportunity of those avenues of drawing close to Hashem. And that's what he felt. And it wasn't that he wanted to have a falafel in Hadera, or that he wanted to stand and watch the sunset by the Mediterranean, or even that he wanted to daven by the Kotel, so to speak. It was that he wanted to bring Bikurim. He wanted to pick the fruits of his tree and set aside that portion for the Kohen and fulfill the mitzvah of Truma. And with all that he accomplished, with everything that he achieved, with the famousness that Moshe commands throughout the universe today, Moshe felt deprived, but spiritually deprived. The same way, you might hear a person say sometime, yeah, I've made my money, I've had my fame, I've traveled all over the world, but if only I could have, won a Super Bowl or whatever is remaining. So here we see that same human energy and that same human proclivity and that dimension of the human soul being expressed in its loftiest way in connection with attaching themselves for Hashem. there's even a reference here because the word Yigara is used the third time it's used, is when it comes to mitzvot. There's a sentence here, and it's in Devarim 13:1. I don't have the page number right here. But the sentence reads along the lines that you're not allowed to add, and you're not allowed to detract, lo yigara, when you do a mitzvah. In other words, if the Torah tells us to have 4 hadassim, and on our 3 hadassim, on our lulav, and I only have 1. Again, it happens to be you can fulfill the mitzvah with 1, so I don't want to mislead anybody. But in other words, mitzvot are not there for us to mess with. Why use the same word yigara? Doesn't seem to apply there. So I want to answer because all of this points to a deep, soulful recognition of the value of doing a mitzvah. The opportunity to not play around with them, not add on to them. I'm not going to keep Shabbos for 2 days during the week because I really like chant. And by the same token, I'm not going to have my Shabbos end at noon because I've got some important date I want to go to. Instead, I'm going to treat Shabbos as here, Lomo Yigara. I don't want to be deprived. I want to bring Shabbos in at its appointed time. I want to experience the full experience of its holiness. I want to exit the Shabbat at the right time, sensing that fulfillment of that taste of the world to come, that sense of being together with my children, with my family, that experience which is akin to being in the next world already. That's the way we understand Shabbos. So you see how the Torah use of a word here, it's for us codified in this, what's going to take place on Friday. The idea that there's a Pesach Sheni, and even if you live far away, Pesach Sheni applies in the time of the Beit HaMikdash. So that, again, it's not because I was on vacation necessarily, but in other words, if matters at home, if I live in the north of Israel, and matters at home really deprive me of the opportunity to travel down to Yerushalayim and celebrate Pesach on the 15th of Nisan when it's meant to be celebrated. So of course I make my Seder in my house in the north of Israel. And of course I eat my matzah and my moror and drink my 4 cups of wine. And I explain things to my children. I observe Pesach wherever I am. But then if I have the opportunity, I then travel down to Yerushalayim and I participate in Pesach Sheni because Hashem is reaching out to me and saying, I also don't want to be, I don't want to miss the connection with you. God, want you to sit with me in the confines of Yerushalayim and celebrate the Exodus from Egypt. So it becomes a reciprocal sense of this commitment to solidifying a relationship, to becoming one, to joining together. And I want to tell you how this plays out according to a very, very captivating and interesting and exciting comment made by Rabbi Nissel. And a lot of people in San Diego and elsewhere have had the opportunity to study with him and learn with him, travels to San Diego once in a while. But he wrote a piece about Pesach Sheni. And he makes a connection that is very sublime. And it also applies to this time of the year. This is a time of the year when we think a lot about Rabbi Akiva. We think about the fact that he said that the greatest principle of the Torah is v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, which we read in last week's Parsha. We also think about the passing of his students who died at this time, and that's why we have a period of mourning going on. But what do we remember of Rabbi Akiva? We remember the story. What's the famous story? He was a simple shepherd. He was not connected to Jewish learning. He was not connected to Torah. He was already 40 years old. And he happened to be out with his sheep, shepherding his sheep, and he noticed water dropping down and hitting a rock. And very famously, he made a conclusion. He said, if that water could penetrate that rock, then Torah could penetrate me. And what Rav Nissel points out here in a beautiful understanding of this story is that he says, just to make such a quote unquote far-fetched conclusion, one has to imagine and understand how deeply within Rebbe Akiva was a yearning to be more than he was. He described it as a lonely despair, a sense that, gee, I pass by a study hall, I see people studying Torah. I log onto my computer and I listen to an uplifting shiur, but it's not part of my life. And he feels that that's what was churning in deep in the recesses in the heart of Rebbe Akiva. And Rebbe Akiva, sensing that and feeling cut off and feeling despair and feeling nigara, I'm less than, I'm deprived, I'm being left out, I'm not part of this wonderful vocation of the Jewish people, which centers around taking inspiration from Torah, learning Torah, being uplifted by Torah, fulfilling the Torah. I'm not part of that. But now when I see water hitting rock and making an impression, it awakens within me the sense that it's not too late. I also can join the party. I also can overcome this sense of isolation and despair and deprivation if I only set my mind to it. Because if water can make an impression in a rock, then certainly Torah, which is part and parcel of the being and the soul of every Jewish person, it's certainly going to make an impression on me. And as the story goes, he rolled up his sleeves, he went to Cheder, he learned Aleph Beis sitting next to his child, no embarrassment, a sense of determination. He studied and he grew, and he became the greatest sage of his generation. He became the one with the yeshiva with 20,000 students. Because he became a source of Torah himself. Again, a story in the Gemara that even Moshe Rabbeinu was shown a vision of Rabbi Akiva studying and teaching Torah, and Moshe felt like, he surpassed me. What did you need me for, God? All of this coming from sublimating and channeling a natural sense of yearning, what we call, again, a fear of missing out, an interest in connecting with other people, an interest of being a vibrant part of the Jewish people and the Jewish story and the legacy of Judaism, going all the way back to Abraham and stretching all the way in the future until the end of days. That's what connected in Rebbe Akiva. So, of course, what we need to think about is how we can connect with this. Yeah, we all have our list of our bucket list, whatever you want to call it, our feelings of deprivation, our what if scenarios about our life, our ideas that I'm missing out, I'm deprived, I've got my claims to make against the world, against God, against my parents, against my family, against my children, whatever it is. And we know that those feelings don't bring a person anyplace. They bring a person down. They create despair. But there's a different side of that coin. There's a side of that coin that takes a serious look at water dripping at a rock, takes a serious look at the joy of the Jewish people celebrating Passover, and says, I want to be part of that, and I want it to be part of me for generations, and I want my children and my grandchildren, and I don't want an exemption, and I don't want to hear, oh, you're doing a big mitzvah, don't worry about missing out on that. I need to be part of that, so the Torah adds this component of Pesach Sheni. And the daughters of Slavchad feeling as though our father needs to have a spiritual legacy in the land of Israel that will go on forever. And we need to seek it out, and we need to go to Moshe, and we need to ask him and question him and say, Moshe, perhaps there's another dimension, there's another page in the Shulchan Aruch that would apply to us. And lo and behold, that page gets written with the very intention and the depth of their feeling. And this is the respect we have for mitzvot. We have 613 of them. They're a lot. They take up a lot of time. They take up a lot of effort. They take up a lot of resources. But look what they can propel us onto. And therefore, let's treat them with the ultimate of respect. So what we need to think about this week is what is our personal lama nigara moment that we can look within ourselves and channel within ourselves and say, let me add something else to my list. What about being a greater Torah scholar? What about being a more respected, giving pillar of the community? What about being a person whose life is marked more greatly by kindness and doing for others? Why should why should my children after me be deprived and left out of this fantastic legacy? So on Friday, let's grab a piece of stale matzah, chew on it, chew on some of these ideas, and please God, we will find channels within ourselves which are sincere and seeking and spiritually attuned. We should all have a great week. Thank you.
Rabbi,
Yes.
When you say chew on a piece of matzah, is there some sort of ritual that we should be doing? I mean, literally, should you be eating matzah?
Well, the custom, it's just a custom because the real institution of Pesach Sheni would have been you and I who did not bring a Paschal offering last month because there was no Beit HaMikdash to do it in, coming to Yerushalayim and buying our goat and sitting down on the hillside of Yerushalayim together and sharing it and eating it and telling the story. But that doesn't apply today. So the custom of chewing a piece of matzah, though, is to evoke within us these concepts, these underpinnings. And the idea that as we tap into our own sincerity, we also, in our own way, can write a new chapter of the Torah, not a chapter at odds with what's been before us. We're not looking to add, we don't create our own new mitzvah, but we can add a chapter of belonging and connecting to the Jewish people and really enjoying this tremendous relationship with God, that Kedusha, that holiness that each and every one of the 613 mitzvahs affords us.
So it's more contemplation.
Yes. And it's to evoke this sense within us.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful.